Hello, this is Jenna Cassell. Welcome to our program, Viewpoints of Deaf Culture. If you're interested in deaf culture and improving your ASL reception skills, this program will help you do both. We were lucky enough to have 6 deaf people who were willing to share their experiences and opinions and viewpoints on this topic for this video. For the purposes of the video, I asked them a series of questions which they then answered, and you'll be able to look at to improve your skills in ASL reception and learn about deaf culture. If you'd like a further challenge, you can turn off the volume on the video and practice your interpreting. Don't worry though, if you have an issue and you need to turn the volume on again to hear the interpreter, you can. If you're ready, let's dive in and begin the video. Good luck. Question 1. When you were growing up, was your experience that of being the only person in your family who was deaf, or were you a part of a deaf family? What kind of school did you go to? And how did you learn sign language, and when? This is Brenda's response. I grew up in the New York City area. My family was all deaf. My parents were both deaf. My 3 sisters and I were all deaf. Most of my family prior to my parents' generation were able to hear. There were a couple of exceptions. On my father's side, there was a deaf brother and a hard of hearing brother among his 4 siblings, and the rest could hear. On my mother's side, there was a deaf brother, and my mother, who was the baby, her brother, who was deaf, was the 3rd born, and the other 3 in that family could hear. Interestingly, my parents were first cousins. They didn't realize that when they first met each other. Interestingly, yes, they lived in different parts of the city. At that time, it wasn't so easy for people who lived in different boroughs to get together. There were no trains or public transportation like there is before. But they did meet at a deaf club, which is typical of deaf people of their generation. When my father asked my mother if he could date her, she said that he had to ask permission from her parents first. So when they went over to the house and began their introductions, and they're chatting with my mother's parents, they were the ones that put 2 and 2 together and realized that they were first cousins. They married anyway, and maybe there would have been issues despite, there was deafness, but other than that, no issues, luckily. My 4 sisters, as I said, my 3 sisters, the 4 of us, were Eileen, Sheila, and Elaine. My 3rd sister passed away recently of cancer. She was the one I was very close with. Interesting educational experience I had in that let me go back a little bit. My parents both went to the Lexington school, and they decided to send my 2 eldest sisters to the same school, but they were not happy with their education there. They thought it was a very slow process of education. They weren't really feeling like their daughters were challenged, so they pulled them out and placed them into another school that was more of an oral approach. There was another school at that time in our city called Fanwood, but it was only open to boys. It was a military school and not co-ed at the time. The girls went to the oral school for girls, which was called PS 47, and they really flourished there. So my parents decided to send my sister and I, the two youngest, to that school as well, but we were not very happy there at all. We were very disappointed by the experience. I especially didn't like it. I was told, and the message was that that being a deaf person was a bad thing, sign language was a bad thing, and the constant exposure to oral training was downright mind-numbing. So my parents decided to send me to what was called mainstream program. And at that time there were no interpreters, no written messages for me. I was expected to sit in the front of the class and just get the information by lip reading the teacher. I had to ask my fellow classmates what the teacher was saying, and this was a 4-year struggle. And I don't remember a lot about it, to be honest. I actually blocked a lot of it out. It wasn't the best time in my life. So I asked my parents if I could please go to another school. They were telling me, look, you should stay. Your grades are great. You're getting straight A's. Why would you want to go? But I, with some friends, was so frustrating. I ditched school. I just kind of wandered out. My parents were beside themselves. But my two sisters who were older than me, my two older sisters, said, look, we know where she is. And they found me, and that's how I ended up at Fanwood School. At that point, it was a co-ed school, and it was more of a deaf school approach. So I had an oral school for the deaf, a mainstream program, and this residential school for the deaf as part of my education. Here's Ed's response. My family all could hear. When I was 3, I contracted meningitis, and that's what caused my deafness. My family didn't realize until I was in the hospital recovering from that illness that I was deaf. I actually was in a coma. I woke up and I saw my mom reading to me, but I couldn't hear her voice. I saw her moving her lips, and I asked her, Mom, why aren't you saying anything? I can't hear you. So that's when the doctor was called in, and it was determined that I was deaf. I have a brother, 1 year younger than me, and at that point it was determined that I needed to be an appropriate education needed to be found for me. My father was a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and just adjacent to that campus was a school for the deaf. And there were dorm supervisors at that school for the deaf that my father contacted, and it was found that there was a program for deaf education affiliated with the deaf school at San Francisco State University. So there was a person who worked at the school for the deaf who was also a student at San Francisco State, and this person was hired to be my tutor when I was a young child, during school and on weekends. And this started when I was 3 and continued until I was about 5. This gentleman lived with us, so got a small stipend and room and board. And then I went to actually, I didn't go to the school for the deaf near my house. My parents found a school in Southern California that they thought was more appropriate for me. So my family moved down to Southern California, specifically Long Beach, from the Bay Area in California, so I could go to this school. There was a class of 12 or so deaf and hard of hearing students that were in a self-contained classroom at this school. And then, so we were in that class for a while, and then we would go into mainstream classes with other students for the rest of the day. when I was in 5th grade, I went into a full-time mainstream program, and then from 7th grade to 12th, I was in a regular school with no special services for my deafness. I went to a school called Long Beach State University for my undergraduate, again with no special services. One of my teachers had a friend who had experience and knew about Gallaudet University for the deaf. And when my parents heard about it, they were not impressed with it because at that time, Gallaudet University was not an accredited university. Later on, my father was on a business trip back east, and he happened to make a side trip to Washington, D.C., and saw or paid a visit to Gallaudet, and at that time it was accredited, so he approved of it at that point for my education. When I went there, it was my first exposure to sign language, to deaf people as part of a community, and other than that, I would have to say it was not a very rigorous education compared to what I had at Long Beach State. I did get exposure to deafness and deaf culture, and the social aspect was great, but as far as education, I didn't really get much out of it. And it wasn't until I went to Cal State University in Northridge that I was really interested or became educated in the language of sign language. There was a book that had been published by William Stilko, a hearing guy, about the linguistics of deaf that was poo-pooed by many of the deaf community in Gallaudet. And again, proof that it wasn't really a place of academic excellence, it was more a place of socialization when I was there. I graduated from there, Gallaudet, then I went into the work world. I was working for, say, 12 years. And then I had a sort of midlife crisis. I quit my job, did a lot of traveling, and went back to school for my master's degree at California State University. And I learned a lot from one particular individual, Larry Finger, a good friend of mine who was a wonderful educator. He taught a class called Deaf Adults in the Community, I think something like that. And at that time was when I really learned fully about the culture of deaf, and has inspired me to this day. This is Jenny's response. I didn't know many deaf people, if any, growing up. I didn't even know I was deaf until, I remember seeing people moving their lips, and I guess figured out that that was talking, that was communication. I didn't understand too much of it, but I went to a school for the deaf in Springfield, Illinois, with 500 other deaf students, and it was a good experience, I'd have to say. No complaints about it. It was a good experience. I became deaf when I was a very young child. I almost died. My family thought I was going to die, but here I am, 84, so obviously I haven't. But my parents brought me home from this illness, and they gave me something to eat, and I pushed it away, and they realized, oh, I'm not crying, so that's when they realized I was deaf, and here I am, 84 to this day. Now this is Mark's response. I grew up in South Dakota on an Indian reservation. My family was all hearing. It was Rosebud Indian Reservation there. My father was an employee with the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the reservation when I was born. And I contracted German measles when I was 3, is how I became deaf. At that point, my parents were, having had no real experience with a deaf child, started doing some investigating about what where I should go to school. It was determined I should go to an oral school. My father had a background in education. He was a university educated professor. My mother's family lived in Seattle, so actually that was where the school for the deaf, the oral school for the deaf, was located, that they thought I should go to. So the family decided to pay a visit to the school. I think this was probably around when I was 4 or 5 years old. And I remember coming to the school and feeling very ill at ease because nobody was like me. I mean, I was used to being around all natives in the reservation, and at the school I was the only Native American there. Everybody was Caucasian, so it was quite a shock. I remember a teacher coming right up to me, introducing themselves and, you know, being very enunciative with their speaking to me, and I was not used to that approach at all. I'm not sure, I think that was their approach. I remember thinking at the time that I would not be able to understand anything if I was to stay at this school. It would be completely awkward for me, and as it turned out, my parents concurred for their own reasons. They looked at the education and they thought it was not going to be a good fit for me. So that's when it was determined that I would be going to a school for the deaf rather than an oral school. School for the deaf meaning emphasizing more of a sign language approach. And I was relieved secretly when I heard about that. And my parents were relieved because they found out that a school for the deaf did have these special services for speech and speech training and so forth that made them feel like it would be a good place for me too. My father needed to find a school for the deaf that was near an Indian reservation so he could continue his work. There were 3 different places that we looked at, one in Washington State, one in New Mexico, and one in Oregon. So we looked at those 3 different places, and it turned out that my father found a job in a reservation right near the School for the Deaf in Oregon. So that was the place that we went to. So the family packed up from South Dakota. Some of my siblings were disappointed about the move because they had already established rapport with their friends in schools and at the reservation. But we did move to Oregon nonetheless. We settled down at the Indian reservation near the deaf school. This was a place called Warm Spring Reservation. And I was relieved once we got there to see that we were around other Native folks again. It was a very comfortable setting for me. But then at the deaf school, Oregon School for the Deaf, I guess was around 5. This was spring of the year, so it was only a couple of months left in the school year. I was put into the school as a new student, and it was quite shocking. There were so many people that weren't like me. They were all white. I just felt like I was a lone outcast. I remember crying. I wanted to go home. I just was so upset. But I'm not really even sure how I told my parents this, because I feel like I did express that to them. I'm not sure if I told them by speaking or by signing, but it wasn't until later that I realized that there was one boy there who I felt safe with, a darker skinned child who gave me comfort because he was more like me. So I finished the term, I went home for the summer break, and then I went back to the school in Salem, which is where the School for the Deaf was, in September of that year. So that was probably the fall of '63. And I remember noticing that in the classroom there was a real emphasis on speech training. And it wasn't until we were in the dorms that the expression of communication through sign language was emphasized. So there were 2 different worlds within the deaf school. There was the oral approach in the classroom with this cumbersome technology that we all had to use to get the the messages from the teachers on very uncomfortable headsets. At that time there were no padding on the headsets. They were these hard plastic things, and these cumbersome microphones and so forth. And I just remember just feeling like it was so uncomfortable. But that was my experience. I actually stayed there for my entire education from that time until I graduated from high school. And I remember my siblings getting to go to different schools. They went to an elementary school, and they transferred to a middle school and a high school. And I remember feeling, wow, so envious of that they got to do that I was stuck on one campus and they got to go to different schools. It didn't seem fair to me. I wasn't sure why that was the case. My parents said, look, you have to stay at the school for the deaf. That's what they have. I remember being very upset about that. But I remember, in general, feeling like it was going to be a good experience. In theory, or actually in practice, I didn't realize that until later on, after school. I realized the difference between being maybe the only person at a school that was deaf, where I was the only deaf person, as opposed to being at a school with other deaf folks. It wasn't until later that I realized how lucky I was to have gone to a school for the deaf where I was around so many deaf people. Here's Marilyn's response. I went to a school for the deaf, started there when I was 4 years old. I'm not sure if I was born deaf or not. I don't have any knowledge of that. I know that my mother's family was all deaf. She was an offspring of a deaf family. She was not deaf herself, but her parents and many of her relatives on that side, great uncles, aunts, and so forth, were deaf. So there's a strong deaf trait in that family. Might have skipped my mother's generation, but it certainly landed on me again, and I continue that tradition. I went to the School for the Deaf in Columbus, Illinois. I graduated from that school. I went from elementary school through high school to the same school in Columbus. My siblings could all sign. There were 5 of us. I had a deaf sibling who was second in the line, and I was the youngest. All of them knew how to sign, as I said, and it wasn't really a formal American Sign Language that we spoke. It was our own chafy sign language that we developed as a family. Now here's David. Not really sure where the deafness came from that is in my family. I'm deaf. My 2 siblings are deaf. My father doesn't have any actually overt deafness in his family background, nobody that is identified as deaf, and the same with my mother's family, but they must have both had some sort of recessive gene that was then that then manifested in the 3 of us being deaf. The oldest sibling is my brother, my sister is second, and I'm the third. It was determined that my oldest brother go to the School for the Deaf, and my sister went there too. I went sort of in their footsteps, and that's where I went to school. This is question 2. Jen is asking, what do you see as the main difference between deaf culture now and how it was expressed or how it manifested in your growing up? What is the main difference? Mark saying, I see a big difference between the past and now regarding how deaf culture is expressed. There was a lot more repression of culture before as compared to now. There's more recognition and more openness. I remember being part of Native culture growing up, and then I remember also interacting with the mainstream white culture. I remember sort of feeling like I had to hide my Native identity at that time, my background, my culture. When I was interacting with white folks, I felt like it wasn't actually until later people would say, "Oh, you're Native," and I would say, "Well, yes, I am." I wasn't really sure why they would ask me this question. It was sort of an internalized repression, I guess, because I didn't realize I was hiding it so much that people didn't know that that's what I was. I wasn't asked the same question when I was within the Native community, so it was only when I was out in white culture that I would be asked that. And I would be asked things like, "Can you hear? Can you read lips?" I was used to that kind of question as a deaf person, but I wasn't used to being asked about my Native culture. Very interesting to have grown up with that experience. I remember growing up and later on in life seeing that there was a lot more emphasis on cultural diversity expressed through workshops on different ethnic groups that you could see in the world at large, and there was a development more of an awareness of interpreters and education within the deaf community, and also a more recognition of people of color within the deaf community. Yes, there was that aspect before, but it was more of an emphasis on signing or oral training or that kind of thing. And then it wasn't until the 80s that there was a recognition of ASL as a distinct culture or expression of culture, and as also as an expression of cultural diversity, or in addition to expressions of cultural diversity within the topic. So it'll be interesting to see what the new topics are as we approach the millennium here. Marilyn saying, "That's a good question. I notice a big difference between now and how it was in the past. During my grandparents' time, we would always go to deaf clubs. That was the center of deaf culture. We would go there to watch movies, to socialize, take turns. Well, we'd go to different clubs and see different folks at these communities. There was more of a cohesiveness within the deaf culture. Now, that seems to be less of the case. There's more kids that are going to mainstream schools. They're not really exposed to deaf folks like they were at the deaf schools in the past. No, I have to blame and thank technology for this. It has helped us a great deal, but it has also caused our community to be less cohesive. There's not that opportunity for us to all get together and chat like it was in my grandparents' time. I remember if they wanted to go visit somebody, they couldn't just get on the phone or email. They had to drive all the way over and see if they were home, and then if they weren't, they had to leave a note. That's how they stayed in touch. I mean, now you can just call somebody or email somebody, and it's much easier. But it has come at a loss of cohesiveness within the community. David's saying, I would say yes, there are some changes. The main thing I think that is impact that change is technology. I remember when I saw my first TTY device in high school. It was this table-sized device that you would type and send information through the telephone. And I remember thinking, wow, it's cumbersome, but now we have so much more access to technology through our handheld devices. And I think, although that's great, it's come at a loss or at a detriment to contact and cohesiveness within the community. I remember people would get together you'd go to movies together, to see captioned movies together as a community, and that world is sort of gone. Now we have videotapes that we can just watch on our own. We have less events where people are getting together as a community at large. People are getting together in smaller groups, more clique-like. So I think I miss that. I do hope that we can maintain somehow that spirit of the deaf community that we had in the past, while holding on to of course, and embracing the the technological advances. I feel like with video interpreting technology, video relay service, that's going to be another impact. I wonder and hope that our culture stays alive despite the changes that are brought on us by technology. These changes will continue, but we'll still have our culture. Here's Jenny. I don't notice a big difference between now and what it was like before. Really, I don't see a lot of difference. It seems pretty much the same to me. I mean, it's fine. It doesn't seem like it's a big difference. Here's Ed's answer to question 2. There's more of an understanding within the community at large about what deaf culture is. There's more of a exposure to our culture through knowledge of sign language. I think I was born too early, unfortunately. I remember if I could, I would go back to school again, and I would have the support of interpreters like students have now. There's more pride within the deaf community. People aren't feeling like they had to hide their deafness like they did in the past. I remember in the past, people would be embarrassed to be seen signing in public. They would always put their hands down if they were thought they were being noticed by people outside, like they were ashamed of it. Now, with more cultural expression of deafness in the media, people are less ashamed of that, and they're more willing to use their sign in public. Here's Brenda. Yes, I've noticed a lot of changes, some positive and some not. Some positive changes are that deaf people have a lot more opportunities for different kinds of work than they did in the past. Professions that they weren't able to access before. Generally, deaf people could only work in very few manual industries, maybe the printing industry, but now they're able to become professionals, doctors, psychologists, veterinarians, dentists. There was more of a sense of cohesiveness within the deaf community in the past. Now there's more of a diaspora effect. People are more spread out. I think in the past, there were, since there were such limited opportunities, people would be together in this more cohesive grouping. But now, with all of the technology that we have, with captioned movies, email, all that kind of stuff, there's not such a necessity for people to go to deaf clubs to get access to culture. But that's come at a loss, because the deaf clubs are now folding across the country, and it's a shame, because that's a really cherished part of our culture. But interestingly, I've noticed a little bit of a swing back to that idea of cohesive culture. People seem to be kind of swinging back to that. I remember, I'm seeing more deaf pride festivals and things like that, where people who are interested in sign or who are deaf themselves can go to watch storytelling or deaf poetry, that kind of thing, deaf joke telling. And it's almost like we're getting an echo of the deaf cultural experience that was so common in the past. we might be swinging back to that. I'm not sure if we'll go back to the full idea of deaf clubs, but at least there's a swing back to that. This is question 3. Jen is asking, what would you say the main difference is between the culture of deaf folks and the culture of mainstream hearing, if there is one? Marilyn's saying, I'm deaf. I feel like growing up I just thought that was a normal thing. I thought that was who I was. I went to a deaf school. It was my identity as a deaf person. And then after I graduated from Gallaudet University and I entered the work world, that's when I realized, oh my goodness, that's when I saw that being deaf is not quite the same as being how other people are. You know, I had a deaf family that I hung out with. I was hanging out with people at the deaf school, and when I was in the work world, I realized, oh, now I'm going to need interpreters. I'm going to need these different things to help me interact with the culture at large. At Gallaudet, you know, everybody, support staff, educators, the entire community knew at least some sign. And then when I went into the work world at the Department of Justice, I was the only deaf person there, and it was quite shocking. You know, this was 1992, but you know, I loved my work, and I took it upon myself to educate people about what I needed, and I educated them about what I needed to make sure I had equal access to the job. I remember exposing them to deaf culture, to sign language, to showing them how best to communicate with me. And I feel like, yes, there's a separation between my deaf identity and what I do within the work world, and I guess short term I have to identify with that community as well as a hearing person, or as a deaf person in a hearing employment world. David's saying, okay, the difference between deaf folks and hearing. I think I'd have to say the main difference is meaning the deaf people's reliance on visual contact in the visual mode. I notice people that can hear are often, wandering with their eyes when they're talking with us, and deaf people, you can always tell a deaf person because their eyes are riveted at you. It's a big difference. Another difference I would say is the use of the tactile mode. Hearing folks are often very standoffish about being touched. Deaf people use touch very often in communication to convey information. So we are comfortable with giving long hugs, say, after when we're going to be leaving each other after an interaction. And not so much with hearing people. There's more an affection, a comfort with that kind of affection within the deaf world. Brenda's saying, interesting question now. Remember, I grew up in a deaf family. I knew that there were people that were not deaf in the world, but within my neighborhood, there were a lot of deaf people, and the people that could hear were there. I mean, I acknowledged them. We knew that they were there. We played together. You know, at the time I remember being a young child. I saw that there were people that were using their mouths to communicate, and I would ask my mom about that, and she explained the difference between deaf folks and hearing. So I did feel different. I felt like our culture was, I guess, different than hearing culture. Became much more apparent in school when I was it was conveyed to me that deafness was inferior to hearing mainstream culture. I was a little bit of a bully, I guess, in my neighborhood. I was very insistent that my playmates learned how to sign. I remember this one little girl saying, my mother says I don't have to learn sign language, you have to learn to read my lips. Something like that, some sort of rule. I was like, listen, you have to spell. If you're not, you will not be our friends. And I excluded this girl from our little playgroup. And I remember after several days, this was summer, we were all out of school, and this girl being excluded saying, look, I'm sorry. This was assigned to me. She would spell and say, look, I will communicate with you that way. And I remember thinking, wow, what a control freak I was at such a young age. But it was really control of my communication. And here I am to this day teaching ASL and in a way using that control in a positive way. I remember feeling like, yes, I do feel frustrated that I sometimes have to resort to other ways of communication, but I get by. I'm realizing more and more how different it is to be deaf than hearing. I can't really put a finger on why it is. I know one thing different is that they hear and we don't. But I read this book by an author, Patton, and I think it was co-written by Patton and Humphreys. I forget the name of the book. I think Voices. Yes, Voices from Deaf Culture. That's what it was. That helped me so much to see that there are different sort of centers that we have as deaf people that is different than what hearing folks have. And imagine finally understanding that as an adult. It wasn't something I had to go to a psychologist about. It was something I was able to figure out on my own, I think. Ed saying the most important difference, I think, is their view of the world. We view the world through our eyes and through touch, not through our ears. That's the main difference. That really influences our values. It influences our, how can I say, behavior and so forth. Behavioral norms. We're much more using our eyes, and that can lead to interesting conflicts, like say being misunderstood. If I'm staring so much at somebody, a hearing guy in conversation, they think I might be just paying too much attention. Really, I'm just using my eyes and touch. And deaf folks will often use touch to convey different communication needs, and that it can make hearing people feel very disconcerted. Another difference is that hearing folks like the lights down. They like a more romantic mood in a conversation or in the environment, but as deaf people we need the lights up so we can see each other. Jenny's saying, I don't see a big difference between deaf and hearing. I really don't. I've worked with deaf or hearing folks. It doesn't seem like it's very different to me. Mark saying, I think the main difference is through communication norms. And basically the sort of central point is whether your ears work or not. I remember growing up in my hearing family, I felt almost like I was hearing within that situation because I was around hearing folks, and I noticed when I was at a deaf school I would have to sort of change my channel from the hearing aspect to more of a switch over to developing a more visual channel. I have to shift my channel to more of a ears not working, eyes on mode. So that's the big difference I see. And I see it also in my adult life. I remember dating hearing women, and I remember one specific woman who was a fluent signer, but I would still notice that when we were together, her eyes weren't completely on me like they would be if she was deaf. They would always be shifting away, and I would see a switch to the hearing channel when some sort of sound would come into her awareness. And that's not something you see in interacting with deaf. We just have that one channel, so you don't see that constant switching back and forth within deaf folks. Question 4. If there was a magic pill that a doctor could give you that would make you become hearing, would you take it? Why or why not? David saying, no, I wouldn't take it. I was born deaf. I have deaf culture within me as part of my flesh and blood. If I had that opportunity, I can't say I would take it. No. I'm happy the way I am, and I think if I did take it, it would just completely throw things off. I would have to learn how to speak and, just enter that whole mode of living. I would not want to do it. No, I'm satisfied with how I am. I wouldn't take it. Jenny's saying, no, I'm fine being deaf. It's all right. I don't think I would need to take that. No. I would be afraid if I took something like that, it would make me worse off than I am before. I'm satisfied with how I am. And that's the truth. Ed saying, well, I would say no. I guess I would say yes if there was an antidote that would be able to get me back to being deaf again. I might try it as a challenge. To be permanently that way, no. I grew up as a deaf person. I'm happy with how I am. And what's the point of changing it? No, I wouldn't do so. I'm happy with how I am and with my deafness. It's what makes me unique. I remember when I was in high school, I was with this girl, and people would say, oh, you're Shirley's boyfriend, right? And now, when I was in CSUN, people would forget about there, and people would focus more on me, like, oh, who is that girl that went with Ed? And I became more of the center. So again, that's why I'm happy being deaf. Brenda's saying, well, no, I'm happy with who I am. I'm deaf, and I have been. I guess it'd be like saying, somebody was born with different color skin. Would they want to change it? I guess they could dye it. I don't know, but no, I remember since I was small, my family was deaf. I had that as role models. My family, that is. So if there was if I was born as the only deaf person in a family, I might long for that. But since I didn't feel that way growing up, I don't have that idea. I guess sometimes I do wish I could speak. There's so many frustrations sometimes trying to communicate or miscommunicate with hearing folks, and I guess makes me feel like I would want that sometimes. It's by the same token, maybe you want to be taller, and everybody wants to have something that they don't have. So I guess on that point, I guess sometimes I think about it, but no, I wouldn't seriously consider it. Mark saying, I would resist taking something like that. And the reason is that I feel like if I were to take that pill, I would have to completely change the foundation of who I am. I mean, my body is wired to being deaf. I'm like a tree. And to grow another branch, a hearing branch, I don't think I want to do that. I mean, my mind might be able to function as a hearing person if I were to take this pill, but my body is already rooted in my deafness, my development, my awareness, my just how I move through the world, my values, all those things are predicated on the fact that I don't hear. So why would I want to change that? My ears, I don't think would help me. I really don't think taking that pill would be the best thing for me. I would resist it. I'm satisfied with myself as a deaf person and the fact that I get my information through my eyes. I've been that way my whole life, or pretty much my whole life, and I'm satisfied with that. Marilyn's saying no, I wouldn't take it because I'm deaf, and I've been deaf. I've been put on this earth to be deaf, and I'm proud of that, so I would not change it. And here's question 5. What do you think the most important thing is about deaf culture to teach hearing people? What do you think that would be? If there was one thing to pick, David's saying, oh gosh, there's so many. I think it's that we need to emphasize how important it is for us to get access to communication, or to communicate well with hearing folks, in whatever means we can. Whether it's maybe getting an interpreter as a bridge between our different modes of communication. There are always going to be barriers, and we need to figure out how we're going to break those barriers down, either through an interpreter. If we don't have interpreters available, then writing notes or whatever we need to do. I remember when I first started writing notes to hearing folks, they would say, "Oh, how interesting! That's a great way to communicate," and it worked. It was fine. So I think that's one thing we can convey for a short term. It wasn't a loss for me. It's fine. It's easy, and that's something we need to tell people. Ed's saying the most important thing that we need to do is, hold on.